people. And the context makes that very clear because the promise is then immediately follows by specifically mentioning various classes and types of people. It says, upon your sons, daughters, young men, old men, servants, handmaidens, and so on. All kinds and types and classes of people. God promised that He would pour out of His Spirit upon both men and women of all ages and various conditions and from many different cultures and countries. And that's what He did and is still doing. Well, these are just a few of the many, many examples of how universal terms are commonly restricted in their reference in the Bible. But I trust these are enough to prove the point. And what does this prove? Well, it proves that we must derive our understanding of the extent of the atonement, not merely from the universal terms that are sometimes attached to it, but from the larger biblical context within which the atonement is included and is presented to us. What does the Bible teach about the relationship of the atonement to the covenant of redemption? Union with Christ, the priesthood of Christ. What does the Bible teach that the atonement actually is? A real substitution. A real substitutionary satisfaction of the penalty of sin. What does the Bible teach about the effects of the atonement? What is the meaning of words like redemption and propitiation and reconciliation? How's the atonement connected to the gift of the Spirit in regeneration? And having come to grips with this overall teaching of the Bible about the atonement, we must then interpret the words world and all accordingly. But this is not only true with regard to the larger biblical context. Sometimes just paying careful attention to the immediate context of a text that is using universal terms in connection with the atonement clarifies the meaning of it. Let me show you an example. Turn with me to Romans 8:32. Now, the reason I'm choosing this text is because this is the very text in which John Wesley preached his famous sermon in defense of a general atonement and against predestination. This is the text he preached that sermon from. And it was that sermon and the misuse of this text that finally provoked a reluctant George Whitefield to publish a letter in opposition to his friend's theology and his use of this text. All right, Romans 8:32. He who did not spare His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all. And of course, Wesley's argument is this is speaking of the general atonement. He delivered Him up for us all. How shall He not with Him also freely give us all things? Now, does this really teach universal redemption as opposed to particular redemption? You say, well, the text says that God delivered up His Son for us all. Yes, but according to the context, who is the us all being referred to here? Here we have an indefinite pronoun, us. Who specifically is the us Paul is talking about in this passage? Well, let's find out. Obviously, the us of verse 32 are the same people as the us of verse 31. What then shall we say to those things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Well, who are the us's of verse 31? They're obviously the same people described in verses 28 to 30. Verse 28, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God. Here they're described by the primary spiritual grace of the renewed heart. They love God. Then he describes them in terms of how they came to this. To those who are the called. Not merely are called in a general sense, but are the called according to God's purpose. Then they're described in verse 29 as the ones God foreknew. And remember, he doesn't say what he foresaw, but whom he foreknew. They're described as the ones he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. The ones whom he also called to himself. Not just generally, verse 30, but effectually, because whom he called, in this way, he also justified. They're the ones he justified. The ones who shall be glorified. And indeed, so certain is their glorification that he speaks as though it were already realized. At the end of verse 30, verse 31, what shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but delivered him up for us all. And then we're told that the us all are the same persons to whom He freely gives all things. And then how are the us's of verses 28 to 32 identified in verse 33? They're none other than the elect of God. Verse 33, who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. So you see, the immediate context here, not to mention the larger overall biblical context, makes it abundantly clear that verse 32 is not teaching that God spared not His own Son, but delivered Him up for every single individual member of